Asian American and Pacific Islander heritage. Whether speaking to first, second, third, or fourth generation immigrants, their impact is powerful and inspiring. From migrant laborers to inventive trailblazers, it is time to acknowledge their hardships, culture, achievements, and beliefs. More than 30 years after President George H.W. Bush signed a law that designated May 1990 as the first Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, much of Asian American history remains unknown to many Americans, including many Asian Americans themselves. To many, the resulting lack of awareness was highlighted after the March 16, 2021 Atlanta spa shootings that left 6 women of Asian descent dead. The killings fit into a larger trend of violence against Asians failing to be seen or charged as a hate crime, even as leaders lamented that racist attacks are not who we are as Americans. The earliest known Asian immigrants arrived in what's now the United States in 1587. They sailed from the Philippines, then the Spanish East Indies, to California's coast. As early as the year 1765 and through the 1800s, Filipino sailors known as Manila men, who worked as crew or indentured servants aboard Spanish galleons, jumped ship in the Gulf of Mexico and established the first Filipino-American communities in what is now known as the continental United States of America. The 1854 California Supreme Court case of People versus Hall. George Hall had been convicted of murder through the testimony of 3 Chinese eyewitnesses. On appeal, the court disqualified the testimony. California banned specific groups, Negroes, blacks, Indians, and mulattoes, from testifying against whites, but Chinese was not included. This judge became legislator by interpreting, through his convoluted logic, that the Chinese were Indian and or black. The opinion spewed vile racism, citing the imminent threat that if Chinese people can testify against whites, they would become full equal citizens. February 19, 1862, President Lincoln makes California's coolie trade ban national. The so-called coolie trade began in the 19th century to circulate indentured Asian workers to plantations that enslaved black African Americans had previously labored upon. Coolies were thought of as suitable replacements to enslaved labor as the Atlantic slave trade was being dismantled. The completion of the United States Transcontinental Railroad on May 10, 1869 connected the nation in a way that would forever change its fortunes. But this dream of cross-country travel would have never been realized without the effort of Chinese laborers, who were paid meager sums to work 6 days a week on the railroad's construction from 1864 to 1869. March 28, 1898. The Supreme Court upholds birthright citizenship in United States versus Wong Kim Ark. Wong was a Chinese American born in San Francisco to Chinese parents in 1873. When he returned from a visit to China in 1895, immigration authorities denied his re-entry, citing Chinese exclusion laws that barred Asians from immigration and U.S. citizenship. Wong, however, asserted his right as a U.S. citizen to be permitted back into his country. In 1905, business people in Shanghai organized a boycott of U.S. products. At the time, the racist Chinese Exclusion Act barred Chinese laborers from entering the United States, but American immigrants often turned their backs even on those Chinese whom the law allowed in: merchants, students, and diplomats. Inspired by growing Chinese nationalism, the boycott sought to change this. Good for them. September 4, 1907, the Bellingham Riots. Spurred on by the inflammatory rhetoric of Nationalist Asian Exclusion League, hundreds of white workers swept through the coastal town of Bellingham, Washington at night, looking for Indian immigrants. The rioters pulled Indian workers out of their bunks, set their bunkhouses on fire, stole their possessions, and beat them. 1913. California passes the Alien Land Act. In spring 1913, the California State Assembly passed a bill that prohibited aliens ineligible to citizenship from owning agricultural land and limited their lease term to 3 years. Although this racial category, aliens ineligible to citizenship, apply to all immigrants from Asia, the architects of this bill specifically had the Japanese in mind. Most students will learn something of the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, when 112,000 people were removed from homes, lost careers, income, and savings, were confined in desolate inland camps managed by the War Relocation Authority, and suffered multi-generational trauma that lingers to this day, despite decades of community care and activism. 1965 to 1970, Filipino farm workers led the Delano Grape strike. On September 7, 1965, members of the Agriculture Workers Organizing Committee, a predominantly Filipino union, went on strike against Delano grape growers. After 5 years, the global campaign of the Delano grape strike was won and new contracts were signed in 1970. June 19, 1982, the killing of Vincent Chin. In the late 1970s and early 80s, there was a global oil crisis that drove the U.S. economy into a recession and led to the collapse of the auto industry. The American manufacturing sector blamed Japan for that. In this climate of anti-Asian hate, a Chinese American named Vincent Chin was killed in Detroit because he looked Japanese. This is part of a historical pattern in which Asian Americans are attacked whenever there is a crisis in America. March 28, 1983. Chol Soo-lee's release from San Quentin's death row. In June 1974, Chol Soo-lee, a young Korean immigrant, was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for a San Francisco Chinatown murder. While serving his life sentence in state prison, Lee was convicted and sentenced to death in May 1979 on a first-degree murder charge for defending himself during an armed prison yard assault by an Aryan Brotherhood gang member. For 42 years, the Coalition of Asian Pacific Americans has hosted a festival in celebration of AAPI Heritage Month. In a typical year, the event, which takes place in New York City's Chinatown, includes food, art, and musical performances highlighting AAPI culture in its many forms. Throughout May 2021, the Coalition of Asian Pacific Americans will be hosting virtual events through Event Hub. Among the 10 new PBS programs premiering during Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month include Amy Tan, unintended memoir about the life and literary career of the Joy Luck Club author, and The Donut King, about how a Cambodian refugee created an ultra-successful donut business on the West Coast.